For 500 years, the world of war belonged to iron and pride. From the rolling fields of France to the misted valleys of England, the armoured knight stood as both warrior and god, the living image of order in a chaotic age. His armour gleamed like law made visible. His charge felt like divine judgment. Every poem, every cathedral window reminded Europe that salvation wore steel. The knight wasn't merely a man in armour, he was a social class, a world view, a moving fortress. His mount cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings. His armour was hammered, shaped, and polished until it fit like a second skin. His training, riding, swordplay, scripture, etiquette, separated him from those who tilled the land beneath his boots. To wear armour was to be sanctified. To fight in it was to serve God's design. And yet, hidden beneath that conviction was a fatal blind spot. The medieval battlefield was theatre. Nobles arranged themselves in perfect geometry, banners fluttering, trumpets calling. Combat was personal, one man against another, face to face, courage measured in visibility. It was war as performance, valour as currency. A handful of names would be sung. The rest were statistics buried in mud. But history was already shifting under the horses' hooves. Trade routes were widening, towns were rising, kings were tightening their grip on power. And far from the castles and courts, a quiet revolution was growing, carved from wood, taught by repetition, destined to unmake the Iron Age of the knight. In the 13th century, few believed that peasants could destroy nobles. Knighthood was the spine of Europe, a hierarchy wrapped in armour and ritual. The church blessed it, calling knights God's militia. Chivalry became their scripture, courage, loyalty, mercy, piety. But chivalry also drew lines between those who fought honourably and those who fought to win. In this code, distance equaled dishonour. A weapon that killed unseen was branded cowardly. The sword was noble because it exposed both men to risk. The bow was despised because it levelled that risk. So when the crossbow began to appear, a weapon that could pierce armour and required no noble birth, the Pope condemned it outright. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council declared it unfit for Christians, a weapon too equal for the age of hierarchy. But no decree could stop innovation, and innovation rarely asks permission. In the forests of Wales and the borderlands of England, a different idea of power was taking shape. Yew trees, tall, slow-growing, naturally elastic, became the raw material for a new kind of weapon, the longbow. It wasn't invention that made it revolutionary. It was multiplication. A knight was a singular masterpiece. A longbow could be built by the thousand. For centuries, armour had advanced faster than the tools meant to break it. Mail-deflected swords, plate-absorbed lances, but the longbow would reverse that race, not by surpassing steel, but by overwhelming it. You didn't need 10 knights, you needed 10,000 arrows. The world that birthed the longbow was a world of inequality. Peasants farmed, paid taxes and died in wars they didn't start. The hierarchy was carved in stone, kings above nobles, nobles above men, and God above all. But ambition is the natural enemy of order. England's kings, always fighting abroad and short of coin, began searching for cheaper power. In the mountains of Wales they found it. For generations, Welsh clans had wielded massive self-bows made of yew, simple to look at, devastating to face. They fired long, heavy shafts that could smash through shields and mail. The bows required brutal strength to draw, but their range and accuracy were unmatched. During his 13th century campaigns, Edward I, later called the Hammer of the Scots, saw entire charges of armoured men collapse under storms of Welsh arrows. Steel was no longer certainty. A weapon of common wood had humbled royal metal. Edward recognised genius when he saw it. He conquered Wales, but he kept the weapon, and from those hills he imported an idea that would reshape his kingdom. Edward turned imitation into system. He recruited Welsh bowmen, studied their craft and forced it into English discipline. He realised that while armour could only serve the few, the bow could empower the many. What he took from Wales was not just a weapon, it was a philosophy. That philosophy was scale. A single knight could cost as much as a manor. But for the same coin, a king could arm and feed 100 archers. In an age obsessed with birthright, Edward I built an army of ability. He issued decrees requiring archery practice on Sundays and feast days. He banned games that distracted men from shooting. Every village became a training ground. Every boy learned to pull a bow before he learned to read. The countryside turned into an open-air armory. The law of the land was simple: draw or be fined. For the first time in Europe, war became democratic, not in politics, but in physics. Strength, not pedigree, determined worth. The muscle of the poor became the engine of the state. Archery transformed more than the battlefield. It rewired society. A peasant who could hit a mark at 200 yards earned respect, even from those born above him. The longbow didn't erase class, but it blurred the edges. Skill was creeping into a world ruled by lineage, and the English crown, ever practical, saw the future. An army of archers was an army the king owned directly. No feudal contracts, no rebellious barons, no divided loyalties. The longbow wasn't just a military tool, it was political technology. Each arrow drawn by a yeoman tightened the monarchy's grip. By the early 1300s, the system was in place. Archery guilds thrived. Royal records show vast stockpiles of arrows at the Tower of London, tens of thousands sorted by length, weight, and purpose. Forests of yew were declared crown property. The English economy bent toward war. It's difficult to grasp how radical that was. A medieval society built on nobility and faith was turning itself into an early form of industrial state, one where efficiency mattered more than ancestry. A king had found a way to weaponize discipline itself, and in that discipline lay England's future victories. When the 100 Years' War erupted in 1337, England was ready in a way no other realm was. Every village had trained men who could shoot 6 to 10 arrows a minute. Every county had craftsmen who could produce thousands more. The English army wasn't just an army anymore, it was a factory that walked. The age of iron was about to meet the age of wood, and the world's most expensive soldiers were about to be undone by its cheapest. What began as rebellion in the Welsh hills had become state policy, and soon it would become legend. A new weapon stood ready to challenge everything Europe believed about warfare, faith, and class. The English king would test it against the might of France, against the flower of knighthood itself, and when he did, the battlefield would never look the same again. England didn't invent the longbow, it inherited it from the wild, rain-beaten hills of Wales. When English knights rode west in the 13th century, they expected rebellion. What they found was revelation. The Welsh fought barefoot and furious, their arrows whispering through fog and rain. No shining armour, no banners, only 6-foot bows of yew, bent by raw muscle and patience. At close range, their shafts punched through mail and hide. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, saw more than defiance. He saw technology, he conquered Wales, and he took its bowmen with him. From conquest came transformation. Within a generation, England began to build the first national army of archers in Europe. Edward's heirs understood something revolutionary. You could train a farmer to be lethal. A sword demanded years of skill. A longbow demanded time, discipline, and endurance. Archery became law. Every Sunday after church, every able-bodied man was ordered to shoot. Parish fields turned into training grounds. Fathers taught sons, brothers competed with brothers. The sound of arrows striking straw became the heartbeat of village life. Football was banned. It distracted men from practice. Even the king inspected targets when he travelled through the shires. Archery became identity. A yeoman was judged not by birth, but by his draw. His pride was the curve of his bow, the straightness of his shaft, the strength in his fingers. Then government turned tradition into industry. By Edward III's reign, the Tower of London held mountains of arrows, hundreds of thousands, sorted by size and weight. Every goose in the kingdom owed the crown feathers. Bowyers and fletchers worked in shifts. Forests of yew were reserved for war. Imagine it, a fortress not filled with gold but with feathers and ash. What England built was not a weapon, it was a system. Cheap to make, easy to train, devastating in numbers. A single knight cost a fortune, his armour forged, his horse bred, his squire fed. For the same money, a king could arm 100 archers, and those 100 could blot out the sun. Training reshaped bodies. Skeletons found on the Mary Rose tell the story. Shoulders widened, spines curved, arms twisted by years of tension. These men were living siege engines. They drew weights of 150 pounds or more, enough to send a heavy arrow nearly 300 yards. The motion was violent. Step, lean, draw to the jaw, release, again and again, 10 times a minute. To wield such power required diet, stamina and culture. Villages held contests. Taverns awarded ale and bread to the best shots. Archery wasn't just military, it was social. It bound countryside and crown together in a single discipline. By the early 1300s, England was a nation of archers, thousands of men legally required to practice war every week. When the 100 Years' War began in 1337, the kingdom already possessed the most disciplined missile force in Europe. At its core was a new idea of victory, not through heroic duels, but through organised fire and calculated range. Warfare had become arithmetic, distance, timing, trajectory, and the man commanding that arithmetic sat on the throne. Edward III would soon test his creation against the greatest cavalry in the world, the chivalric nobility of France. He would unleash his yeomen across the Channel, a human machine built to erase the age of knights. The longbow had been born in conquest. Now it would return the favour. It's August 1346. The fields of northern France are heavy with rain and fear. On one side, the most powerful kingdom in Europe, France, commanded by King Philip VI. On the other, a smaller English army led by Edward III, tired, wet, but perfectly organised. For 2 months they've marched and raided, fighting off pursuit. Now they turn to face it. The French outnumber them 3-1, knights in shining armour, banners snapping in the wind. The French believe numbers and nobility will win the day. The English believe in geometry, patience and wood. Edward sets his men on a ridge near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. Archers form long wings on both flanks. In front of them, sharpened stakes hammered into the mud, a forest of deadly points waiting for horses. In the centre stand English men-at-arms, calm and ready. It's the first time in history that discipline, not lineage, decides the field. Late afternoon, the French begin to advance. The air fills with the hum of crossbow strings. The hired Genoese mercenaries fire first, but their weapons are slow to reload and the strings are damp from rain. Their bolts fall short. Then the English reply. A single horn sounds. Across the ridge, thousands of yew-bows bend in unison. The first volley arcs high, invisible death against a grey sky. The second follows before the first even lands. Within seconds, a black rain falls on the French vanguard. Horses rear and scream. Knights drop their lances and clutch at their helmets. The ground turns slick with panic. The Genoese break and run, only to be cut down by their own allies. French knights, enraged, charge through them to reach the enemy. The charge collapses before it begins. Each gallop ends in chaos. Arrow after arrow punches through mail, pierces gaps in plate, kills horses mid-stride. Men fall trampled by their own. One chronicler wrote that it was as if a storm of snow fell upon the French. For hours, the rain of arrows never stops. An English archer could shoot 10 times a minute, and there were thousands of them. That means tens of thousands of arrows each minute. No army on earth had ever faced fire like this. By nightfall, the field is a slaughterhouse. Over 1,500 nobles lie dead, counts, dukes, and princes. The French lose more men in one afternoon than in years of campaigning. The English lose fewer than 100. Crécy becomes a legend. It's not just a victory, it's a demonstration. It proves that power has shifted, from the individual hero to the trained unit, from expensive armour to disciplined muscle, from arrogance to calculation. Across Europe, kings and generals take notice, but many refuse to believe it. They call it luck, terrain, or even divine intervention. They tell themselves chivalry can still win the next war. They are wrong. The English will do it again, at Poitiers 10 years later, and at Agincourt 70 years after that. Each time, the same result. The storm returns and the knights drown in it. Crécy is more than a battlefield. It's a hinge in history, the moment the Middle Ages begin to crack open. The age of the mounted aristocrat is ending, and the sound of its ending is the whistle of an arrow. Crécy didn't just end a battle, it began an arms race. For the first time, armour met its match, not from another knight, but from a weapon that cost a day's wage and grew on trees. The shock was existential. How could a peasant's arrow tear through a noble's steel? The answer was physics and panic. In the years after Crécy, blacksmiths across Europe went to work. Armour grew thicker, heavier, and more sophisticated. Steel was tempered with new alloys. Visors became narrower, helmets rounder, chest plates curved to deflect impact. Knights were turning themselves into human tanks, but at a cost. They could barely move. Their horses groaned under the weight. They needed help mounting, help breathing, help fighting. The English, meanwhile, didn't need to change a thing. Their weapon already worked. A longbow was brutally simple: 6 feet of yew, a string of hemp, and an arrow nearly as long as a man's arm. Draw weights reached up to 150 pounds, the equivalent of lifting a grown man with your fingertips. Archaeologists who studied the Mary Rose warbows discovered that these weapons could shoot arrows over 300 yards. At close range, those arrows could punch through chainmail, shatter bones, or pierce the gaps in plate. Each arrow carried around 100 joules of kinetic energy, roughly the impact of a modern handgun bullet. But unlike a bullet, it didn't stop at the surface. It twisted, tore, and kept going. Tests on replica armour show the truth. The very best steel plate could survive a direct hit, but most soldiers didn't wear the best steel, lesser iron plate, common among foot soldiers and poorer knights, dented, cracked, and failed. Even when arrows didn't pierce, the blunt force was enough to knock men unconscious. So the question wasn't whether an arrow could kill a knight, it was how many knights could survive 1,000 arrows in a minute. The longbow's deadliest advantage wasn't just power, it was repetition. A trained archer could fire 6, 8, even 10 arrows every 60 seconds. Multiply that by 5,000 men, and you get 50,000 arrows in the air before a single knight reached the line. The math was apocalyptic. This was the dawn of statistical warfare. Victory by numbers, not nobility. Every English army became a living equation. Armourers tried to keep up, but the economics were hopeless. Forging a full suit of plate could take weeks and cost a fortune. A yew bow could be made in a day. 100 arrows could be fletched in a morning. An empire built on honour was being dismantled by arithmetic, and the battlefield was changing too. Knights no longer faced other knights in elegant duels. They faced storms of arrows that didn't care who they were. Each battle became less personal, more industrial. The age of craftsmanship was meeting the age of production, yet the longbow was also brutally demanding. To master it, you had to train for years. The bodies of English archers were warped by it. Bones bent, shoulders enlarged, wrists thick as wood. Their skeletons, found centuries later, tell a story of men shaped by repetition and violence. They weren't elite warriors, they were living machinery, and that was the genius of it. England had turned its commoners into a weaponized workforce. They were cheap, loyal, and endless. The French could train 100 knights. England could train 10,000 archers. It was quantity that bred quality, but success always creates imitation. The French began experimenting with their own longbow corps. Other nations imported Welsh bowyers, copied English tactics, and tried to match their discipline. But imitation without infrastructure failed. England's advantage wasn't just the bow, it was the culture that surrounded it. Every Sunday, every parish, every boy shooting at a straw butt. That was logistics. That was empire. By the time the 100 Years' War reached its middle decades, both sides were spending fortunes in an arms race between wood and steel. One side perfected armour, the other perfected aim, and the result was a generation of battles that turned Europe into a laboratory of destruction. The next great test would come almost 70 years after Crécy, in a muddy field between two forests, where the flower of French nobility once again rode into history, ran into the storm. October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day. The morning air in northern France is cold, damp and heavy with mud. King Henry V of England stands with an army half-starved and exhausted. For weeks, they've marched hundreds of miles through hostile territory, hounded by the French. Disease has taken many, food is gone, their clothes are soaked, their morale fragile. But Henry knows what his men don't yet fully grasp. This is not just survival, this is destiny. Ahead of them waits a French army more than 3 times their size, thousands of knights and men-at-arms, the pride of French nobility. To the French, this should be an execution, not a battle. To Henry, it's mathematics again. He surveys the terrain, a narrow, muddy field between 2 thick forests. Perfect. The French can't outflank him here. They'll have to come straight through. The English position themselves like engineers of fate. Archers dig sharpened stakes into the ground, angled forward to stop cavalry charges. Behind them, small detachments of dismounted men-at-arms form solid defensive lines. They wait in silence. The French, meanwhile, are confident, overconfident. They see an English army cornered and weak. They see honour waiting to be reclaimed after decades of humiliation at Crécy and Poitiers. They see revenge, but they don't see the mud. Rain falls through the night, turning the ploughed field into a swamp. The French form up in glittering lines, armour polished, banners raised, visors down. They look magnificent and doomed. Henry rides down the line of his men, bareheaded, speaking softly. He reminds them that they stand together not as lords and peasants, but as brothers. Today, he says, the man who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. It's not just a speech, it's transformation. A king invoking equality before battle. The trumpets sound, the French advance. It starts slow, heavy armour, soft ground, horses struggling to find footing. The field that was supposed to deliver them glory is eating them alive. Then the English release the first volley. Thousands of longbows bend. A shriek of wood and hemp tears through the mist. The sky darkens. Arrows rain down like iron hail. Within seconds, chaos erupts. Horses scream and tumble. Knights fall, crushed under their own ranks. The mud grabs them, drags them down, suffocates them. Arrows rattle against helmets and breastplates, punching through gaps and joints, cutting throats, piercing armpits. Each volley lands before the last is finished. The French keep coming. Pride doesn't retreat. But pride can drown. The advance turns into a slow-motion disaster. Thousands of pounds of steel sinking into filth. Those behind push forward, unaware that those ahead are already dying. Bodies pile up. Men suffocate in armour, face down in mud. A few reach the English line, only to meet archers wielding mallets and daggers. There's no romance here, only survival. After hours of slaughter, the battle ends not with a charge but with silence. Henry surveys the field. 10,000 Frenchmen lie dead. Among them hundreds of nobles, counts, dukes, knights, princes. The flower of French chivalry cut down by men who owned no land, bore no title and fought for a day's pay. The English lose fewer than 400. The arithmetic holds. Agincourt becomes more than victory. It becomes myth. It's the day the Middle Ages begin to end. The day a new kind of soldier, the professional, disciplined, common man, replaces the noble knight as the engine of war. It's the moment courage without calculation dies. The longbow didn't just pierce armour that day, it pierced ideology. It proved that precision, training and technology can overturn an entire social order. Europe watches in stunned silence. Kings take notes, generals whisper new doctrines, and the knight, once a symbol of God's favour, becomes a relic of poor design. Agincourt isn't the end of chivalry because the French lost. It's the end because the world finally saw that bravery without strategy is suicide. Henry V returns to England a hero. His men return legends, but the longbow, not the crown, is the true architect of victory. It is the machine of its age, efficient, repeatable, terrifying. The knight's code of honour will live on in poems and songs, but in the mud of Agincourt that code died with the men who believed it made them untouchable. The battlefields of northern France grew quiet. The crows fattened, the banners rotted, and Europe tried to understand what it had just witnessed. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, 3 fields, 1 lesson. The age of the knight was over. For centuries the armoured noble had stood as the living symbol of divine order. He was power made flesh, a man whose armour and horse were worth a village, whose birthright was violence sanctioned by God. Now that image lay face down in the mud, pierced by arrows fired by men who paid their own taxes. The longbow didn't just change how wars were fought, it changed who fought them and who ruled afterward. Henry V's victory echoed beyond the borders of France. Across Europe, monarchs realised that feudal armies built on personal loyalty were a liability. A king who relied on his nobles could never truly command them. A king who could hire, train, and pay his own soldiers could command a nation. The English longbow corps was the prototype of that new model. It was professional, organised, centralised. A medieval war machine built not on birth, but on bureaucracy. And bureaucracy was contagious. Over the next century, every major power copied the system. Standing armies emerged. Permanent tax offices appeared to fund them. The military and the state became one. It was the beginning of the modern world. But this transformation came with a cost. The same weapon that democratized war also industrialized death. When 10,000 arrows fall at once, courage means little. The knight could no longer win by skill or valor. Survival became a question of probability. For the first time, war felt mechanical, an equation of range, rate of fire, and yield. Armourers fought back with thicker plate and better metallurgy. Workshops in Milan and Augsburg forged masterpieces. Steel shells designed to shrug off even the heavier shafts. But thicker armour made knights slower, weaker, more expensive. Each improvement in protection narrowed the class that could afford it. By trying to preserve the knightly ideal, Europe priced it out of existence. The longbow's triumph also reshaped culture. The myth of chivalry, that noble blood conferred moral and martial superiority, was shattered. Commoners had become heroes. Ballads celebrated the yeoman archer as England's new ideal, honest, skilled, dangerous, and free. The legend of Robin Hood flourished in this climate, echoing the spirit of men who could humble tyrants with a well-placed shot. And yet, even as the longbow reigned, its own successor was loading powder. From Germany to Spain, new weapons were appearing. The handgun, the arquebus, the musket. These early firearms were crude, slow, and unreliable, but they were easy to learn. An archer needed a lifetime, a musketeer a month. The very logic that made the longbow supreme, mass training and repetition, now worked against it. Gunpowder was the next step in the same story, the mechanization of killing. By the 1500s, the thunder of guns replaced the whisper of arrows. Longbows vanished from armories, replaced by matchlocks and pikes, but their legacy remained written in doctrine. The idea that disciplined, coordinated infantry could defeat aristocratic cavalry became military gospel. The blueprint of Crécy lived on at Pavia, at Naseby, at Waterloo. And beyond tactics, the longbow changed identity itself. It gave power to the middle class, to craftsmen, merchants, and farmers who could now defend their realm without a lord's permission. It shifted the balance between ruler and subject. The English crown, funded by taxes and staffed by professionals, began to resemble the bureaucratic monarchies of the modern age. Feudalism, already cracking under economic strain, now had a fatal wound in its chest. From the mud of Agincourt sprouted the seeds of modern citizenship. Duty replaced lineage, skill replaced birthright, and war, for better or worse, became a matter of the many instead of the few. The echoes of that revolution still ring today. Every time a modern soldier trains with standardized equipment, every time logistics decide victory more than courage, the spirit of the longbow lives on. It's strange to think that such transformation began with wood, a curved branch of yew, a string of hemp, feathers plucked from a goose, but history often turns on humble hinges. So when you picture a knight in shining armour, imagine just beyond the edge of the frame a line of mud-stained archers. Men who stood shoulder to shoulder, drew until their spines groaned, and changed the world without ever knowing it. They didn't fight for glory or poetry, they fought because they were told to. But in doing so, they re-engineered war, rewired society, and ended an age. The arrow beat the armour, and in its shadow, the modern world took aim. The longbow ruled Europe for barely 2 centuries. Then, almost overnight, it was gone. Its downfall wasn't defeat on the battlefield. It was arithmetic again, the same math that once made it unstoppable. Training a longbowman took 20 years. Training a musketeer took 20 days. The change began quietly. In the late 1400s, small hand guns, metal tubes fired with smouldering wicks, started appearing in the arsenals of Burgundy, Spain and Italy. They were unreliable, deafening and dangerous to the man using them, but they had one terrifying advantage. Anyone could pull a trigger. The longbow's draw weight was measured in muscle and time. Gunpowder required neither. Within decades, entire formations of arquebusiers were replacing archers across Europe. At first, the bow and gun fought side by side, arrows for volume, bullets for punch. But technology learns faster than tradition. By 1513, at the Battle of Flodden, English longbowmen made their final great stand. They fought fiercely, loosing shafts into the ranks of Scottish pikes, and won the day. Yet even in victory they were ghosts. Already the crack of gunfire was rolling across the continent, drowning out the hiss of arrows. Armour too was transforming. Steel plates thickened again to resist bullets, but each increase in weight slowed the night further. Soon, smiths realised they couldn't build a man-portable fortress strong enough to stop lead. Gunpowder had finally done what the longbow had begun. It made armour irrelevant. The chain reaction was unstoppable. Castles were redesigned for artillery, cities built bastions, kings raised permanent regiments armed with firearms. Europe's old feudal armies, knights owing service to lords, evolved into national militaries paid in coin and drilled by command. The state was now a war machine, and bureaucracy its bowstring. But even as the bow faded, it left fingerprints everywhere. Modern gunnery manuals borrowed its language. Volleys, arcs, ranks, salvos. The logistics perfected under England's arrow factories at the Tower of London became the blueprint for gunpowder supply chains. Even the mindset endured. Range, discipline, synchronization, the mathematics of death. Culturally, the longbow became myth. England remembered her archers the way Sparta remembered her hoplites. Common men turned national legend. Ballads, murals and plays glorified the yeoman archer. Sturdy, independent, deadly accurate. He was the prototype of the modern citizen soldier, the man who fought not for a lord's banner but for his country's survival. The French, meanwhile, rebuilt their pride not through chivalry but through firepower. By the 1500s, their gendarmes rode with pistols instead of lances. Chivalry re-emerged as ritual, no longer a tactic. Honour retreated from the battlefield to the ballroom. By the time of Elizabeth I, the English crown had officially replaced the bow with the musket. The same queen who urged her subjects to practice the longbow as children would later invest in gun foundries and powder mills. In a single lifetime, the sound of war changed forever, from the whisper of feathers to the thunder of sulphur. Yet the longbow refused to vanish completely. It survived in sport, in ceremony, in the memory of victories that had defined a nation. Archery ranges replaced drill yards. Bows became symbols rather than weapons. Even centuries later, during the Napoleonic Wars, a few eccentric Englishmen proposed reviving longbow units, a romantic gesture toward a vanished age. They never returned to battle, but the lessons they taught never left it. Every modern infantryman who trains in formation, every artillery crew that fires in timed salvos, every drone operator calculating angles and arcs, all inherit something from those muddy fields. The principle is eternal. Coordination beats courage, repetition beats rank, precision beats pride. The longbow was humanity's first industrial weapon, mass-produced, standardized, scalable. It made war statistical, predictable, terrifyingly efficient, and it taught the world that technology once born never unlearns how to kill more effectively. When the smoke of muskets filled the 16th century sky, an era ended. But somewhere, beneath the thunder, lingered the echo of bowstrings, the pulse of a world that had pulled itself into the modern age. The arrow had flown its final course, and like every revolution, it had changed its creator as much as its enemy.